Welcome to Newsbeacon, your trusted source for breaking headlines, global insights, and sharp analysis from around the world. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. The first sirens wailed across Tel Aviv just before dawn, piercing the silence of a city that had grown accustomed to uneasy peace. In those early hours, the city's residents, many still asleep, were jolted awake by a sound they had hoped never to hear again. The air was thick with anxiety as families rushed to bomb shelters, clutching radios and phones, desperate for news and reassurance. But this time, the sky erupted with a coordinated missile assault from both the north and the south, a terrifying spectacle that lit up the horizon. The city's skyline, usually a symbol of modernity and resilience, was now a backdrop for chaos as hundreds of rockets streaked overhead, their trails crisscrossing in a deadly web. Instead of sporadic rocket fire, a relentless barrage overwhelmed the Iron Dome, shaking the city with explosions on a scale never seen before. The familiar thud of interceptors was drowned out by the roar of impacts, as the city's defenses struggled to keep pace with the sheer volume of incoming threats. Emergency services were paralyzed, their communications jammed by sophisticated electronic warfare. Ambulances and fire trucks, usually the first line of response, found themselves immobilized, unable to coordinate or even reach the worst-hit areas. The sense of helplessness was palpable, as first responders faced a crisis unlike any before. Israeli Defense Forces outposts near the Lebanese and Syrian borders went silent as swarms of drones targeted military bases and critical infrastructure. These outposts, once considered secure, were now isolated and vulnerable, their lines of communication severed, and their defenses breached by waves of unmanned aerial vehicles. This was no isolated attack. It was a meticulously coordinated assault from multiple directions, hinting at unprecedented cooperation among Israel's adversaries. Maps and command centers lit up with red, showing simultaneous strikes from Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and even further afield, suggesting a level of planning and unity that stunned military analysts. As the sun rose, devastation was everywhere, highways cratered and impassable, power stations ablaze, and the port of Haifa shrouded in thick, choking smoke. The infrastructure that kept the country running was crippled in a matter of hours, leaving millions without power or safe passage. The attack was a decapitation strike aimed at Israel's military, economic, and psychological core. In bomb shelters, civilians huddled together, their faces etched with fear and disbelief. As news trickled in of mounting casualties and widespread destruction, the sheer number of impact sites revealed a terrifying reality. This was a multi-front assault involving actors from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. The scale and reach of the attack suggested a coalition of forces, united by a common goal, and a willingness to escalate the conflict to unprecedented levels. Early casualty reports were staggering, more fitting for a full-scale war than a surprise attack. Hospitals were quickly overwhelmed, with emergency rooms overflowing and medical staff stretched to their limits, forced to make impossible choices as the wounded poured in. It was clear the Middle East had entered a new catastrophic chapter. The region, already fraught with tension, now faced the prospect of a conflict that could redraw borders and reshape alliances for years to come. The world watched in horror as a nightmare scenario, once confined to military war rooms, unfolded live on television. Social media feeds filled with images of destruction, and global leaders scrambled to respond as the crisis deepened by the hour. The question now, who orchestrated this, and how did such a massive operation remain hidden until it was too late? As investigators raced to piece together the clues, one thing was certain: the world would never be the same after this day. The attack was the culmination of months of mounting hostilities, a flashpoint that many had feared but few truly expected to erupt so violently. In the darkness, sirens wailed and emergency lights flickered, illuminating the chaos left in the wake of destruction. It was the latest chapter in a year marked by escalating crises and deepening divisions across the Middle East. Protests erupted in city after city, as anger spilled into the streets and border clashes became almost routine. Tensions between Israel and Iran had reached a breaking point after a joint Israeli-US strike on Iranian nuclear facilities in June. The world watched anxiously as fighter jets streaked across the desert sky, and the specter of open war loomed larger than ever. The fallout from the strike was immediate and severe. It shattered the remnants of the nuclear deal, leaving diplomatic efforts in tatters and pushing Iran to the brink of abandoning the Non-Proliferation Treaty altogether, a move that would have global repercussions. Shadow wars intensified across the region. In September, an Israeli airstrike in Doha targeted Hamas leaders, violating Qatari sovereignty and sending shockwaves through the Gulf. The attack not only escalated the conflict but also exposed the vulnerability of even the region's wealthiest states. On the diplomatic front, volatility reigned. European powers, alarmed by Iran's nuclear ambitions, threatened renewed sanctions, further fueling Tehran's sense of encirclement and isolation. The threat of economic collapse loomed over Iran, heightening the stakes. Egypt, long a stabilizing force in the region, viewed the Doha strike as a reckless provocation. Cairo's leaders warned that such actions threatened decades of fragile peace and could unravel the delicate balance that had kept wider war at bay. These cascading events created a perfect storm. Iran sought revenge, Qatar's prestige was wounded, and Hamas found itself increasingly isolated and under threat. The region's fault lines were exposed as never before. Egypt's influence, once unchallenged, now faced new tests as regional leaders clashed over the path forward. Old alliances frayed, and new rivalries emerged in the diplomatic shadows. Even Yemen's Houthis, emboldened by the chaos, saw an opportunity to align more closely with Iran's so-called axis of resistance, threatening to widen the conflict even further. The region was primed for a dramatic realignment as shifting alliances and new coalitions began to take shape. Headlines blared with speculation, and uncertainty gripped capitals from Tehran to Cairo. The pieces were in place for a violent, unprecedented coalition, one that could redraw the map of the Middle East and plunge the region into a new era of conflict. The stage was set for disaster, as the world braced for what might come next in this web of escalating tensions. The emergency Arab-Islamic Summit in Doha, called after the Israeli strike, brought together leaders from Iran, Egypt, and beyond. Publicly, the summit issued strong rhetoric but little action. Behind closed doors, however, intelligence reports suggested serious discussions about forming a military coalition. Iran's call for a joint operations room, once dismissed as bluster, now found a receptive audience. The failed Doha strike gave Iran the narrative it needed to frame its agenda as a defensive necessity for the Islamic world. Egypt's participation in these talks marked a seismic shift, hinting at a possible break from decades of moderation. The summit, meant for condemnation, became an incubator for war planning. A new alliance was quietly taking shape. Each coalition member had its own reasons for joining, shaped by history, ambition, and the shifting sands of regional politics. Their motivations were as complex as the alliances themselves, woven from a tapestry of old grievances and new opportunities. For Iran, the stakes were existential. After the nuclear strikes, survival became paramount, and restoring deterrence was not just a goal, but a necessity. Iran saw a chance to reassert itself as a regional power, to show its adversaries that it could not be intimidated or sidelined. Qatar, meanwhile, sought to reclaim its prestige and influence after the violation of its sovereignty. The leadership in Doha wanted to prove that Qatar could not be bullied, and that it remained a key player in the Gulf, capable of shaping outcomes beyond its borders. Egypt faced a volatile mix of public anger and the fear of losing its long-held regional influence. Decades of peace and careful diplomacy were suddenly at risk, forcing Cairo to weigh its legacy against the demands of a new and uncertain reality. For Hamas and Yemen's Houthis, the motivations were deeply ideological. Both saw an opportunity to escalate their struggle with Israel, to rally their supporters, and to gain legitimacy on a larger stage. Iran would provide the backbone, planning, weaponry, and strategic guidance, leveraging its vast networks and resources to keep the coalition supplied and coordinated. Qatar contributed funding and wielded its powerful media influence, shaping narratives and rallying support. Egypt offered strategic depth, military experience, and a crucial geographic position. On the front lines, Hamas and the Houthis provided the manpower and the willingness to take direct action, risking everything for their cause. The alliance demanded unprecedented coordination, secret agreements forged in back rooms, intelligence shared across borders, and operations synchronized down to the minute. The coalition's strength lay in its diversity, in the unique assets each member brought to the table. But that same diversity was also its greatest vulnerability, threatening to unravel the alliance from within. The stakes were nothing less than a chance to reshape the Middle East, to redraw boundaries and rewrite the rules of power. but the risk was equally great. Total regional chaos, a descent into violence that could engulf nations and redraw the map in blood. The coalition's attack would begin with a massive cyber offensive, crippling Israel's infrastructure and sowing chaos. Then, a synchronized barrage Hezbollah from Lebanon, militias from Syria, Hamas from Gaza, and Houthis from Yemen would launch rockets, drones, and commando raids. Iran would fire long-range missiles at strategic Israeli targets, while Egypt's involvement, even covert, would force Israel to defend new fronts. Iranian naval forces could disrupt shipping aiming to blockade Israeli ports. The goal, not conquest, but to inflict catastrophic damage and force a political settlement. The complexity, cyber, missile, drone, and ground assaults from 5 directions, would stretch Israel's defenses to the limit. For the IDF, it would be an unprecedented military challenge. For the region, it would be a nightmare realized. The world's response would be swift and divided. The US would rush military aid to Israel and deploy naval forces, while Europe would fracture, some backing Israel, others calling for a ceasefire. Russia and China would shield Iran diplomatically, vetoing UN action and blaming Western aggression. The Abraham Accords would collapse. Arab states would be pressured to sever ties with Israel. The region would split into 2 stark blocs, a US-backed pro-Israel camp and an anti-Israel coalition supported by Iran, Russia, and China. The risk of a wider war and a global crisis would skyrocket. The old order would shatter overnight. Civilians would bear the brunt of the conflict. In Israel, tens of thousands of casualties would overwhelm hospitals, and daily life would grind to a halt amid blackouts and shortages. Millions would shelter underground, traumatized by relentless bombardment. Israeli retaliation would devastate Gaza, Lebanon, and parts of Iran, causing mass casualties and a refugee crisis. In coalition countries, governments would crack down on dissent, and economies would collapse as the region became a war zone. The suffering would be immense on all sides, with entire neighborhoods destroyed and millions displaced. Trauma and anger would fuel calls for vengeance, deepening the cycle of violence. The war would leave a legacy of bitterness and loss. Ordinary people would pay the highest price. Despite the initial shock, the coalition would quickly fracture. Iran's drive for hegemony would clash with Egypt's need for stability and US aid. As costs mounted, Egypt and Qatar would seek exit strategies, unwilling to risk their own survival for Iran's ambitions. The alliance built on outrage would dissolve under pressure, leaving Iran and its proxies isolated. Israeli and US counterattacks would exploit these divisions, hastening the coalition's collapse. In the end, deep-seated national interests would trump temporary rage. The Middle East's old rivalries would reassert themselves. This scenario is a work of fiction, not a prediction. There's no evidence of a secret coalition or imminent attack of this scale. The real events, strikes, summits, and rhetoric, reflect a volatile region, not a unified war plan. Deep divisions, especially between Iran and Egypt, make such an alliance nearly impossible. The scenario is a cautionary tale, not a forecast. In reality, the Middle East remains a web of conflicting interests, not a single unified front.